From the first flight off the United States Navy cruiser USS Birmingham, civilian pilot Eugene Ely made his first takeoff from a makeshift ramp attached to the Birmingham's bow off the coast of Hampton Roads, Virginia on 14 November 1910. Since then, naval aviation reshaped the way warfare would be conducted from World War II to present day. What started on wooden decks with sandbags tied to each end of a rope stretched across the landing area to stop the first naval biplanes, to the radial engine-powered Bearcats, Hellcats, and adventures of World War II. No longer safe from attack, the new carriers and their aircraft brought the fight deep into enemy territory and eventually proved that there were no limits to how far we could take the fight. No longer was the Navy restricted to the range of battleship guns, makeshift bases, nor the politics involved in using foreign soil for airfields. The aircraft carrier was instrumental in defeating the Imperial Empire of Japan. The last wooden deck carrier built was USS Wright, named after Orville and Wilbur Wright, launched in 1945. After the end of World War II, it would take nearly 9 years before the next aircraft carrier would be commissioned. Not until 1 September 1954 was a new breed of ships called the supercarrier were born. Unlike prior carriers, the USS Forrestal would lead the way as the first carrier to be constructed with an angled flight deck built as part of the original build-out. The Forrestal was also the first carrier to be built with steam catapults and an optical landing system. After her predecessor, the USS Wright, CVs 50 through 58 were canceled, with CV-58 contracted to be the USS United States, which was supposed to be the first carrier with an angled flight deck, including a flush flight deck absent of an island to allow strategic bombers to take off and land. With the Air Force's Strategic Air Command feeling that the Navy was trying to cut into their action, Pentagon politics canceled CV-58. In this artist's conception of the future Forrestal, her original layout was similar to the canceled USS United States, but eventually the island was kept, and to this day, all U.S. carriers have the characteristic island on her starboard side. The USS Forrestal was named after James Forrestal. He served as a naval aviator during World War I, the Undersecretary of the Navy in 1940, charged with building the world's largest fleet, resulting in his selection as the 48th Secretary of the Navy in 1944 and eventually the first Secretary of Defense in 1947. On 11 December 1954, the USS Forrestal was christened by Mrs. Josephine Forrestal, widow of the late Secretary James Forrestal. The ship was affectionately called FID, which stood for First in Defense, referring to James Forrestal being the first Secretary of Defense. Because the USS Forrestal was the first of the supercarriers, she was extensively used training naval aviators in the use of her advanced facilities. The Forrestal class consisted of 4 ships, including her 3 sister ships, USS Saratoga, USS Ranger, and USS Independence. When comparing the Forrestal to her predecessor, the USS Wright, the Forrestal was truly an advancement in technology and notably much larger, replacing the straight wooden deck with an angled steel deck. She was almost 400 feet longer, twice the width, over 4 times the displacement, and carried over 3 times the personnel and almost twice the aircraft. The USS Forrestal was designed to accommodate the newest advent in naval aviation, the larger, heavier, and faster aircraft being designed, the jet fighter. Although the Midway and Coral Sea were retrofitted to handle jet aircraft, the Forrestal was specifically designed and constructed to support the future aircraft of naval aviation. The jet age was slowly replacing propeller-driven aircraft, with only the AD-1, E-1, and S-2 being some of the last radial engine prop aircraft used. Although she missed action in the Korean War, the Forrestal saw most of her first 10 years in the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea, conducting exercises, acting as an ambassador of goodwill, demonstrating the capabilities of the new generation of United States carriers to foreign heads of state, and always on standby for the constant unrest of the Middle East. In November of 1963, the Forrestal conducted feasibility tests to see if the modern carrier could accommodate the newly developed C-130 Hercules as a supercod, also known as carrier onboard delivery. Although 21 takeoffs and 21 full-stop landings demonstrated that it could be done, The use of the C-130 with a full flight deck of aircraft was deemed too risky and would actually degrade flight operations while trying to respot the Hercules and other aircraft for normal cyclical flight operations. Besides, the C-130 was too large for the carrier's elevators and would not fit into the hangar bay, thus nailing the final nail into the coffin to using the Hercules in carrier flight operations. Eventually, the C-130 became a mainstay with the United States Marines and Air Force. The Navy eventually settled on the C-2 Greyhound as their new COD, and 45 years later is still the logistics workhorse to this very day. The original C-130 used on the Forrestal in 1963 can be seen on display at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. As with all ships at sea, fire is a mariner's worst nightmare. In July of 1967, the USS Forrestal left her familiar waters of the Atlantic and Mediterranean for the Pacific, arriving in the Gulf of Tonkin for combat operations off the coast of Vietnam. During the first 4 days, the Forrestal had launched over 150 missions into North Vietnam. On 29 July 1967, while preparing for the next launch, a Zuni rocket from an F-4 Phantom misfired into an A-4 Skyhawk across the flight deck, resulting in one of the Navy's worst disasters in history. The Zuni rocket ruptured the Skyhawk's external fuel tank, allowing 400 gallons of jet fuel to carry the fire across the flight deck and into the decks below. The ferocious fire was heroically fought for hours by every crew member aboard the Forrestal. After it was finally extinguished, 134 lives were lost and 161 injured. The irony of this disaster is that it resulted in updated fire procedures and training used by all U.S. Navy ships and personnel to this day. The lessons learned have undoubtedly saved lives and have made life aboard Navy ships much safer. The heroic actions of the men that died that day will never be forgotten. Over the next 25 years, the Forrestal continued to deploy to the Mediterranean to show the flag, provide power demonstrations, allow thousands of people from various ports to tour the symbol of power, democracy, and freedom that the USS Forrestal and her crew would consistently serve to protect. The Forrestal and her crew also provided rescue and humanitarian operations in Tunis, provided air cover during evacuation of Americans from the small island of Cyprus during increased tensions between the Turkish and Greek forces. In 1976, the Forrestal and her crew were selected to lead the International Naval Review in New York City to celebrate our nation's bicentennial, including the ringing of the bicentennial bell by President Gerald Ford. She would deploy to the Med to keep a check on Soviet ships and subs in the area. The Forrestal would continue to exercise the right to freedom of navigation both at sea and in the air, as Muammar Gaddafi found in 1981 after the Forrestal made over 60% of the intercepts of Libyan fighters, which eventually led to the shoot-down of 2 of his prized MiG-23s by F-14 Tomcats from the USS Nimitz. In 1982, the Forrestal transited the Suez Canal for the first time, entering the Indian Ocean and the 7th Fleet for the first time in 15 years since launching airstrikes into North Vietnam back in 1967. Transiting the Suez Canal again in 1988, she served in the North Arabian Sea, spending 108 days, over 3.5 months, at sea before her first Liberty port. After returning from deployment, the Forrestal participated in Fleet Week in New York in May 1989, showcasing the ship and the crew of America's first supercarrier. After 21 deployments, it seemed as if the Forrestal would replace the USS Lexington as the Navy's training carrier and subsequently be moved to Pensacola, Florida. While in Philadelphia for its 14-month overhaul, the Department of Defense decided to decommission the Forrestal, leaving the Navy without a dedicated training carrier. The Forrestal was decommissioned in Philadelphia on September 11, 1993, and was subsequently moved to Newport, Rhode Island. Despite the USS Forrestal Museum Incorporated attempts to raise enough money to make her a museum in Baltimore, in 2004, the Navy had decided to sink her and turn her into an artificial reef, similar to the USS Oriskany off the coast of Pensacola, Florida. Today, the Forrestal sits at Pier 4 in Philadelphia, awaiting the Navy's final call to whether she will be sunk as a target, scrapped, or sunk as an artificial reef. After 21 deployments and over 37 years of service to this great country, we salute the tens of thousands of sailors who served on board her, maintained her, flew from her flight decks, and called her home. To those that gave their lives defending her, you will never be forgotten. America is grateful for your hard work, long hours, dedication, and sacrifices made to defend America and our way of life. To you we say, fair winds and following seas. God bless America.